Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us bright and early for our webinar today on the CAISO grid integration process. This morning's session is going to be on the NRI full network model as well as sync approval. My name is Kelsey Gormley. I'm the VP of our grid integration team here at GridSME. We have a team that's made up of several full-time project managers as well as some independent consultants that have some areas of expertise that they support us in within this process. So we'll kind of touch on some of their roles and responsibilities as we get through the process today and the presentation. My goal for today's training is to provide an overview of the CAISO New Resource Implementation process. There are 6 buckets in that process, and for the purposes of today's discussion, we've broken this out into 2 sections that are representative of the key milestones of full network modeling, synchronization approval, and finally commercial operation. This morning's session, like Sarah mentioned, is really, it's being recorded. So if you want to share this afterwards, I encourage you to do so. And again, please hold all of your questions. I know this is, a lot of folks are going to have questions as we move through. Please just hold them till the end because you may find that your question gets answered as we move through the process. So I just want to make sure we're being efficient with everybody's time. So some of you may have had the opportunity to attend our training yesterday with Taylor McLean. That training was regarding the interconnection request part of our project journey here at GridSME. Some of you have worked with our company in the past, and this graphic may be familiar to you. But for those who have not worked with us, our team, the grid integration team, really gets engaged with you in step 4 of our project journey here, which is really when the project is ready to get through your initial construction design. And then again, as construction moves along, when you're ready to start doing your commissioning and test energy, and then finally, once you reach commercial operations. So that's when my team is typically engaged on projects. We are recommending these days that the earlier we can get started with you, the better, especially if there are due diligence questions around metering or the project setup from a resource ID perspective. So for example, if you have a hybrid resource versus a co-located resource, that would impact how we would get started with the NRI process. Any changes to your interconnection agreement, technology, fuel types, and other factors that could impact CAISO's ability to model the resource accurately, we want to have those conversations with you early on before we even start to create projects and upload documentation to CAISO. So again, for today, our training agenda, the first session is going to focus on resource readiness to enter the full network model through the CAISO approval for sync process. We'll have 2 other sessions today that dive a little deeper into CAISO metering requirements, meter validation, point-to-point testing, and then we'll wrap up this afternoon with the post-synchronization site commissioning, test energy, and commercial operation approval process. So before we dive too far into my presentation today, I did want to give a brief orientation to everybody about the different groups that we interact with during the CAISO NRI process that are at the CAISO, and we work with them through this whole NRI 6 buckets. So the new resource implementation team is our primary point of contact when we start the NRI process. They are responsible for making sure that all of our submittals are routed to the correct teams for review. This slide lists the CAISO business units that we're involved with in that process. So you'll see we've got the EDOS team. They're a major player in the NRI process. They're responsible for certifying the CAISO pulled meters and monitoring the power generation in real time. They review our technical submittals, including our electrical single line diagrams, metering 3-line drawings, communication block diagrams, meter configuration forms, real-time device rig details forms, and they conduct the pre-sync point-to-point testing with your CAISO rig. They also monitor site telemetry prior to approving COD. So we'll talk a little bit about that later this afternoon. So they're a really important group that we interact with throughout the process. Market readiness is another group that we work with. Their acronym is RDT, Resource Data Template. They review and accept our generator resource data template document that we have to submit in bucket 3 of the NRI process. And so we work with them to get all of the market parameters around the resource correctly represented in that document. Short-term forecasting, we work with them. They're responsible for providing the CAISO forecast for variable energy resources. That would include hybrid resources that have a variable energy component. So I'll define that really quickly. That's wind or solar resources. So they would be responsible for providing you with the CAISO forecast if you would like to use it. EMS, they review our single line drawing, they review our modeling files, our NetApp info, which we'll talk about here in a minute, and they are doing so to make sure that the resource is modeled accurately in the CAISO full network model. Operational engineering, this group is broken into a couple different sections. So there's operational engineering north, operational engineering south. And they also review the modeling files that we submit in bucket 1. They're involved in the sync and COD approval process for 3-party projects. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. And then grid assets. So this group is really focused on grid reliability. They will review our control and protection documentation that we submit in bucket 3 and bucket 5. Ops readiness will ensure that the resource is visible in their real-time operations database prior to approving commercial operations. So they will also review the 24-hour contacts that we have identified for the resource to confirm that they can reach the right contact if there is a need to do so during resource operations. And then finally, queue management, they review any pending material modification amendments to the 3-party interconnection agreement, and they confirm that any pending contracts or agreements are executed prior to commercial operation. Right. So now we'll dive into the process of the CAISO NRI process. And the first step in that is making sure that you have an executed interconnection agreement. So for the first few slides here, we're going to focus on the new interconnections. There are lots of different ways that existing resources can become CAISO market participants. That's not what we're going to focus on today. For the purposes of this discussion, we're going to focus on the different types of interconnection agreements that are put in place for new resources. Primarily, my team works with resources that are under an LGIA, which is a large generator interconnection agreement, or an SGIA, which is a small generator interconnection agreement. We also look at where the resource is going to be interconnecting, whether they're connecting at the transmission level and are considered a 3-party agreement, or if they're connecting at the distribution level, which is considered a 2-party agreement. We work with resource owners that are participating in the CAISO market as pseudo or dynamic transfers, qualified facility conversions, and distributed energy resource providers, also known as DERP projects. But again, for the purposes of this presentation, we'll focus on the most common new resource interconnection agreements that our team is supporting. We'll also talk about how to set those projects up using your project details form, as well as how to get access to those projects once you've set them up with the user access administrator that we're working with. All right, so I mentioned there's different interconnection agreements. So we'll start with 2-party agreements. These are also known as WDAT agreements. These are for projects that are interconnecting in the distribution system. So these agreements are between the participating transmission owner, or the PTO, that's the acronym we use. Doesn't mean permission to operate. It means when we use it, it means participating transmission owner and the resource owner. CAISO will not allow us to start the NRI process until we have an executed WDAT agreement if it is a 2-party project. So that's a really important differentiator between a 2-party project and a 3-party project. 3-party projects, we can get started if they have an executed interconnection agreement, or if they have an interconnection agreement that is being revised somewhat. We'll talk a little bit about that as well in the next slide. But for 2-party projects, we were not allowed to enter into a full network model without having that interconnection agreement in place. Some additional differences with two-party agreements, they do not require us to submit control and protection documentation in bucket 3 or bucket 5. And they also have what's called a distribution compensation factor that is programmed into the CAISO meters. This is a value that the participating transmission owners have established that accounts for losses within their distribution system. And essentially what that is kind of a credit on your metering that allows you to take advantage of that. So we'll talk a little bit about that in our bucket 5 discussion later this afternoon. So three-party interconnection agreements. These are projects that are interconnecting at the transmission system level. These are agreements, they're three-party because they include CAISO, not just the resource owner and the PTO like a two-party agreement. So the three-party agreement will go through the interconnection study process. They will get assigned what is called an app and study project number and a queue number with CAISO. Three-party agreements may have one or more queue numbers that represent multiple interconnection agreements that have been combined. And CAISO really does not want to start new NRI projects until we have what they term a construction-ready interconnection agreement. What does that mean? Well, it means they don't want to see any pending MMAs, which are material modification agreements for technology changes or changes in the configuration of the resource. That's a really big one. Until we have those major parameters understood, we are not supposed to start new projects with CAISO. This is a little bit of a shift from how they've historically reviewed three-party agreements, but I think it's important for our interconnection customers to understand that CAISO really wants to make sure that what they're modeling is accurate and that they are not going to have to go back and do a bunch of rework because there were changes being made through the MMA process. So I know there's going to be a lot of questions about that. Please hold them till the end, but it is a really, it's important, again, to understand why that is the case. So what do we look for in a three-party project? Well, before we start even talking about submitting documentation to CAISO for three-party projects, what my team does is we take a look at what is being represented in that app and study project that's assigned when the queue number is assigned. What are we looking for in this? We're looking to make sure that the generation type and the fuel type match up with what project you're asking us to start. We make sure that the queue number is associated properly with that project and that you have enough megawatts available under that queue number for us to start projects. We look at the configuration of the project, whether it's a hybrid, co-located, or a co-located hybrid. That's a thing too. And if there are discrepancies, we need to make sure that those get corrected before we start working on that project. Again, to make sure that we're not doing any rework. So it's really important for us to get access to executed interconnection agreements as well as that app and study project before we even start working through any submittals with you guys. Once we think that we've got a good handle on what the project configuration is going to look like, we will start working on a project details form. I know this looks like a lot of text for one slide, but I'll spend just a couple minutes highlighting some of the important parts of what we do. So this is the form that we use to create projects in CAISO's Resource Interconnection Management System, also known as RIMS. So my team will create this form based on what information is provided to us by the resource owner in the interconnection agreement, as well as how that resource is going to be represented in the market. So for example, if you have a 500 megawatt interconnection that's chopped up into 5 100 megawatt PPA offtake agreements, we would be creating projects based on the number of resource IDs and offtake agreements that you have for that interconnection. So we can create multiple projects off of that one queue number, but we just can't go over the total of 500 megawatts, or else there's some validations run on this form that will make that not possible. So we'll get error messages if we try to do that. So for that reason, we really do a lot of due diligence up front with you to make sure that we have a good, clean understanding of how you guys intend to market this resource once it's created. A couple other things I want to point out on this form that are pretty important when we go to start a project. The legal entity, that has to match the legal entity that's listed on your interconnection agreement. So a lot of times there may be an interconnection agreement in place with, say, like a parent company, but there may be a project-specific limited liability company that we need to have represented on this resource moving forward. If that LLC is not listed on the interconnection agreement, we cannot add that as the legal entity representing this project. So making sure that the resource owner has the correct legal entities represented on their interconnection agreement is very important for us when we go to create the project. It's also going to be important for us when we get to bucket 3 of the NRI process, and we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. But that's one that we really want to make sure we get right before we get started here. The other one that's important is the resource name. So we see this a lot with three-party projects where, you know, maybe it's an interconnection that was signed off 7 years ago, and the project was originally going to be a solar project. So we have ABC Solar. That's the name that's listed on that App and Study project. Well, we have to use that prefix when we go to create a project. That is how CAISO identifies it and associates it with that Q number. So when we create a project, even if it's a battery, for example, we would have to use that same nomenclature. So it would be ABC Solar BES 1, ABC Solar BES 2. So we unfortunately do have to kind of work within those constraints. So what does that mean to you all? Well, if you want to have more flexibility in what you end up naming these projects, be flexible about not putting the fuel type in the interconnection project name. So just name it ABC LLC. Don't name it ABC Solar LLC, because you never know in 10 years when you actually start to build the project what you're actually going to build. So that's something that I think would be helpful for folks to know on this call. Another, so this is still the project details form. It's quite long. Recently, CAISO added this section in section 3C. You'll see here, it says configuration, fuel type, and megawatts. So this is where we would represent a resource that may be co-located. So you'll put in the configuration, there's different options you can select. You can select hybrid, you can select single, you can select co-located. You can select co-located hybrid. So depending on how the resource is actually going to be configured, there's now options listed that we can identify that early on when we go to create those projects. I'll take a moment and talk briefly about what is the definition of a co-located versus a hybrid resource. So for the purposes of what CAISO cares about, hybrid is 2 fuel types behind 1 resource ID. So that can be a battery with a solar component. That can be a battery with a wind component. It can be a combustion turbine with a battery component. If there are 2 fuel types, but they're represented in the market by 1 resource ID, that is considered a hybrid. Co-located means that you have more than 1 resource ID, but multiple fuel types, and only 1 resource ID per resource. So you can have co-located solar facilities, you can have a co-located solar and battery facility, but each of those fuel types or resources would have their own resource ID with CAISO. It also can mean that additional resources are sharing the same point of interconnection, but they're being controlled by an aggregate capability constraint, an ACC limit. We'll talk a little bit about that as we move forward into bucket 3 as well. But for the purposes of where we're at in this process, we just need to understand what is the intent of this interconnection. Are you going to be a single? Are you going to have multiple resources at the same point of interconnection? And we would then list those out in this section of the form. The other portion of this that's important is the implementation date that's listed here in section 6A. That is going to coincide with our full network model sync date. So we'll jump over to that part shortly here as well, because that's really the date that governs the rest of our bucket submittal process from my perspective. Still the project details form. So finally, the last section here that I just want to draw everybody's attention to is the regulatory contracts information. There are 3 contacts listed on this form. Those contacts should be the contacts for when you are going to start your regulatory contracts with CAISO. It will directly pull from whoever you have listed on this form as your main point of contact. My team will always check on this and confirm that those are still the correct contacts when we get there. Sometimes that changes, so we will always check and make sure that those are still valid contacts when we go to execute contracts with CAISO. And you can change them. So those contacts are able to be edited later on if we need to do that. All right, so once we've created the projects in RIMS, we are assigned a CAISO NRI project number. That project number is associated with an organization that has affiliation and responsibility for that Q number that we used to create the project. So the next step is for us to get access to that project in CAISO's Resource Implementation Management System. This process takes approximately 10 days. So I like to let folks know that it's really important for us to do this early before we start submitting documentation or before we need to start submitting documentation to CAISO, because getting access to those projects and being able to upload documentation, that process can take some time. So we really want to make sure that we are working on this early with the team and that we're giving ourselves plenty of time to get access to the project once we've created it, so that we're not, kind of running against the clock when it comes to submittal timelines and dates. All right, so got oriented to how we create a project, what different types of interconnection agreements are out there that allow us to create projects. Now we're going to start talking about actually submitting documents that represent your project characteristics to CAISO. So this is really the first major milestone in the NRI process, which is the full network model. And in order to be included in the CAISO full network model, we have to have all of our bucket 1 and bucket 2 documentation submitted and accepted by CAISO by their cutoff date. So go ahead and jump over to that. So as I mentioned earlier, our NRI process is really driven by the project's target synchronization date. So when I say sync date, I don't mean backfeed. Okay, that's different. I don't mean energization. That's different. Sync as a milestone, when we're talking about it in CAISO, is the date that the resource can start hot commissioning their equipment using test power from the grid. So you're pulling electrons off the grid if you've got a battery that's charging. You're putting electrons onto the grid if you're a solar generator or a battery that's discharging. So that's really what we're talking about when we talk about a sync date. I see folks all the time using those terms interchangeably, and they are not the same thing. So I just want to make sure that's very clear for everybody. Prerequisites to sync are the first 4 buckets of the NRI process needing to be completed, and the project needs to be included in a full network model. So as you can see, the table below here, sorry, I jumped over the wrong slide. There we go. The table below shows all of the full network model timelines for 2025. So the date that I'm looking at when we're starting to kick off a resource is the date on the far end of the table here, the earliest project creation implementation date. That date coincides with the earliest date that your project will be able to synchronize to the grid and start doing test energy if you get into the corresponding full network model in time. So that's the date that I'm going to be, and all of my project managers are going to be asking about. That's the date that we would really want to hone in on with you before we even start submitting anything to CAISO. So I'll give a quick example of what that means. Say you have a project that contractually has to start commissioning and using test energy by May 1st. The full network model that you want to make sure that you get into at the latest is 25 month 4, because that would allow you to sync as early as 4/29. If you miss this model, if you don't get into the one that closes 25 month 4, closes on the 22nd of January, you will not be able to sync for 2 months. That's a 2-month delay in being able to actually do your test energy. Because of that, my team always takes the approach of trying to get you into an earlier full network model if we can. So our recommendation in that case, if you have a 5/1 target sync date, is actually to try and get into the 25 month 2 full network model, so that you have a buffer of timing, so that you're not running out the clock. And in case something happens and we're not ready to do, we're not ready to sync at that time, we have that buffer built in. So again, that's a really important date for us. And this date here, this customer model document submission date, that is when all of our bucket 1 and bucket 2 submittals have to be accepted in order to be included in that full network model. Not uploaded and submitted at the very last minute under the line. No, we want to have everything in at least 10 days prior to that date, so CAISO has their 10 days to review and accept those documents. And again, that's something that my team would help everybody understand what those timelines are, especially which parties on your project are responsible for which documentation that needs to be submitted in this process. Another quick note that I'll add here: how does that sync approval date relate to your commercial operation date? There is a hard-coded timeline that the project cannot achieve COD less than 30 days from your sync date. So that is a hard-coded date with CAISO. So they want 30 days between sync and COD. Something to keep in mind. And I will say, from my perspective, 30 days is very much cutting it short. So. All right, bucket 1 submittals. Again, more text, a lot of text on this slide, but I'm hoping if folks want to use this recording later, they can use it as a reference point. So, like I mentioned, bucket 1 submittals, all this documentation that I've got listed here has to be submitted and accepted to be included in the full network model. I've got the executed interconnection agreement listed as the first one here. That's only required for those distribution connected resources, 2-party resources. We don't need to submit that for 3-party resources. So, but it is a bucket 1 submittal for 2-party projects. Stamped, single line drawing, marked issued for construction that shows the generator, the connection of the generator to the switchyard and then to the utility interconnection. That's a big one that we rely obviously on third parties to provide to us a lot of the time. EPC contractors, engineers of record, those folks need to understand what this submittal is supposed to communicate to CAISO. There's a wonderful bunch of CAISO checklists that my team uses and that are publicly available on the CAISO's New Resource Implementation website that I would highly recommend that any third parties that are working with you to bring resources online review those checklists. But single line drawings are always required. 3-line drawings that show the location and wiring of all CAISO revenue meters to the proposed CTs and PTs, including CT polarity. Those need to be provided if the resource is going to be a CAISO metered entity. We also need to provide this for control and protection purposes. It needs to include all the control and protection devices. So we don't necessarily need to submit this in bucket 1 if the project is not going to be a CAISO metered entity, but we will need to submit it if we don't have one already when we need to do control and protection documentation in bucket 3. So it's, again, it's kind of a choose your own adventure depending on what your intent is with the resource from a metering perspective. COM block, communication block diagram. This is another really important bucket 1 submittal. We need to show all of the originating devices, non-originating devices, and reporting devices that communicate to the CAISO real-time device for telemetry purposes, and your CAISO meters, also met stations if you have solar or wind resource. The NetApp info form, this is a document that they've just updated with CAISO. Typically, this shows all the generating unit data, transformer data, interconnection facility data, breaker data, aux load. But now they're also requesting that we provide at least 3 megawatt points for curve data and the corresponding megavar points. That's a new requirement that they just rolled out within the last couple of months. Rig details, this is super important and a very long lead item that we'll dive into a little bit later. We need a static public IP address that will be assigned to that real-time device with CAISO. There are a couple different communication options available for how you want to communicate to CAISO, but this is a very long lead item for a lot of our projects. For whatever reason, it just takes a lot of time to get a new static public IP address assigned. And if we need to change that address at any point, it can be a little bit of a challenge. So once that IP address is assigned and the project is modeled, we need to jump through quite a few hoops if that changes. So again, just keep in mind that this is one that you want to start thinking about early. What type of communication are you going to have? And then again, where are you going to order that IP address from? Modeling files. So there are 2 documents that we submit for the modeling files. For 3-party projects, these would typically be the same documents that we would be submitting during the interconnection request process. So there's a dynamic gen model and a positive sequence load flow model that need to be provided to CAISO. They need to be in .dyd or .epc format for CAISO to accept them. So again, typically these are part of your interconnection application package for 3-party projects, but for the NRI process, if you don't have those readily available because a lot of 2-party projects don't require them, that's something that our engineering and interconnection team can help support for the purposes of getting into the CAISO full network model. All right, last but not least, site info and topo maps. All right, so these are required for variable energy resources only. They correspond with one another. They are reviewed by CAISO's short-term forecasting group. They need to be in a very particular format. So we'll dive a little bit deeper into what that is in the next couple slides. But they need to show essentially the site boundaries if you have a solar array, or actually the turbine locations and met station locations if you have a wind resource. Met stations you got to show for both, but we'll dive a little deeper into that as well. Okay, so as I mentioned, rig details form, this is a super key submittal for us. It's a deceptively simple form. It looks like it should only take 10 minutes to fill out, but you'd be surprised how many of these we get. we have to really hone in on with each project. So like I mentioned, there's several different communication types available with CAISO. You do not, there's a common misconception out there that you have to use the CAISO's ECN. That is not a requirement, it is simply an option. So if you have a regular old static public IP address, you can use that. You do not have to use CAISO's ECN option if you don't want to. It's available through AT&T, but it's not a requirement. We also recommend a backup IP address be assigned. It's not required, but again, highly recommended. We also recommend that the site have a diverse path for communication as a best practice. So if your main IP address is through, say, a fiber connection that you already have established at the site, great. Have a backup IP that's something else that is, wireless is controversial, but CAISO doesn't really have any restrictions on the type of connections that you can use for site communications. You can use microwave, you can use Starlink if they will give you a static public IP address. You can use wireless if you want to. There's a lot of different options out there, and we do recommend that you have at least 2 diverse communication paths identified for CAISO. And this is really important later on when we get to the telemetry section, so we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Sorry, get some jumping around. All right. Site info and topo map, as I mentioned before, these are requirements for variable energy resources, which would be wind or solar projects. The requirements of this document are governed by Appendix Q of the CAISO tariff. So these are two separate submittals that need to be submitted together and reviewed together. So my team would not upload a topo map without a corresponding site info sheet, and vice versa. They have to be submitted together. They have to be reviewed together because they communicate information to CAISO as basically one submittal. So site information, that's what we're looking at here on this slide. There's some basic project parameters around generation capability, project configuration. Are you hybrid? Are you a single configuration? You also need to identify the geographical corners of the solar array or the locations of turbines. Those need to be in a very specific decimal format. It's WGS 84 geodetic datum. That's the technical term for how they want to see that data. You can't show it to me in degrees of latitude and longitude. That is not an acceptable format for CAISO. And then you also need to provide on the bottom of that form, there's the location of the MET stations. So there will be a section in there where you'll identify the latitude and longitude location of each MET station. You'll also need to provide the characteristics of the generator itself. So for solar sites, you'll have panel information that needs to be included. That's this table over here. And then you'll also, for turbines, you'll have the same corresponding information for each turbine type that you have on your wind project. And that corresponds with this submittal, which is a sample of what we would call a topographical map. So this document, I've seen a lot of gnarly things on topo maps, but what I'll just recommend highly to everybody is minimize the corners. I don't need to see 50 corners on a topo map. 4 is fine, 6 is fine. Anything over that is overkill. So please just minimize the amount of corners that you're identifying on the submittal, or ask your third party who's providing it to do so. MET station locations, here's a note on MET stations. Per Appendix Q, if the resource is greater than 5 megawatts, you have to have a minimum of 2 MET stations. This includes shared MET stations between 2 adjacent resources that can be similar in meteorological conditions and lie in, they say, contiguous or overlapping sites. So if you want to share a MET station with another resource, you are allowed to do that. There's a MET sharing agreement submittal that we would have to draft up and submit, but you are able to share MET stations as well. The trick there is that the resource owners of both resources that are sharing need to have an agreement signed that they are going to be sharing that data, even if it's the same resource owner. So the same person would sign the same document twice, once for each resource. That's just how it has to be. So MET stations should cover at least 90% of the footprint of the facility. They also need their individual identifiers. So for example, we've got MET station number 1, MET station number 2, MET 01, MET 02, whatever you want to call it. They just have to have a unique identifier on this submittal. And again, who's reviewing this document? It's CAISO's short-term forecasting team. Right, so that's bucket 1. We can dive a little deeper into that during the Q&A. I know there's probably a ton of questions folks have on those submittals and specific questions. Happy to answer those. I just want to kind of get through what we need to cover, and then we'll definitely spend a few minutes answering questions. So the next section here is focused on bucket 2 of the CAISO New Resource Implementation process. Bucket 1 and bucket 2 go hand in hand. Bucket 2 has one submittal. So it's either going to be a meter configuration form for all of your CAISO polled meters, or it will be what's called a settlement quality meter data, or SQMD plan, if you are going to be a scheduling coordinator metered entity. What's the difference between those two things? I'm glad you asked. We're going to talk about that in the next slide. All right, so all the differences here is how revenue data from the meters gets to CAISO. For a CAISO meter entity, as I mentioned previously, CAISO pulls those meters directly and then performs the validation process on that metering data on behalf of the resource owner. They do this for free. So this is something that most resource owners, I think, default to as an option. It's also super helpful for if you have obligations around renewable energy credits. This data can be used and submitted by CAISO to Regis and other regulatory entities for renewable energy credit data as well. So a lot of folks default to CAISO metered entities. A lot of off-takers also prefer CAISO metering because there's a perception that it is unbiased data because it's being pulled by and settled by the CAISO and not a separate third-party entity. SCME stands for Scheduling Coordinator Metered Entity, and the difference here, again, is that you will have a third party that is responsible for pulling those meters and submitting revenue quality meter data to CAISO. So why would you do one over the other? There's a couple reasons. So again, like I mentioned, for the CAISO piece, there's this is a free service that CAISO provides. Otherwise, you're paying somebody else to do it. SCME resources do have more flexibility in their ability to do different configurations. So if you have a project that has particular complexity around physical constraints, existing co-located resources, number of connections available in existing meters, there's a lot of different options out there with SCME that can solve some of those more complex metering questions. But again, it's not a cure-all for every project. It's just something that is available when CAISO metering is not an option. The other benefit to SCME I'll just plug is that it does remove CAISO from the meter certification process. So that can be beneficial just given the fact that it does take some time to get through that process with CAISO. And then you also have to provide submittals to CAISO that are in bucket 5 of the NRI process. And then after the project achieves commercial operation, you would then have to coordinate with CAISO every time you want to do any kind of maintenance on that meter, any kind of programming changes on that meter. So there is an element of, kind of removing that complexity from the metering if you go SCME. But again, it's not a cure-all for everything. There's positives and negatives to both. And again, for the scheduling coordinator metering, there's certain responsibilities that then fall onto the resource owner. The resource owner is always, responsible for the integrity of their meter, whether it's SCME or CAISO-ME. But in this case, since CAISO is not pulling that meter and settling it and doing that validation for you, if there is an error or if there is something going on with the meter, it's up to the resource owner to really identify that. CAISO will not be able to help you troubleshoot that. So that's something that you have to do on your own. In addition, the scheduling coordinator or their agent is responsible for collecting, maintaining, validating, and submitting SQMD data in accordance with CAISO's tariff and the BPM. So that's just an added responsibility that needs to be farmed out if you choose to go that route. All right, so at this point, you've decided what you want to do. Do you want to be a CAISO-ME or do you want to be an SCME resource? Well, if you decide to go the CAISO-ME route, what's going to happen is all of the single line drawings that we've uploaded in bucket 1 of the NRI process and identified all of the meters that we're using for CAISO metering, those meters will get assigned a CAISO device ID. And then we will submit a meter configuration form for each of those device IDs. So that meter configuration form is how CAISO sets up their NV90 system for each of those meters. So that's a submittal that we would provide to them in bucket 2. Or again, if you choose not to be a CAISO metered entity and CAISO is not going to directly pull your revenue meters, we submit an SQMD plan that has to show all of the different meters that are going to be utilized for settlements and how that data is going to be settled. So that is a separate form. And if you are an SCNU resource, CAISO's Resource Implementation Management System will show you as having all zeros for device IDs, and it'll say SCME on the label. So there will be no additional documents from the metering side beyond that SQMD plan. I'm not going to go through this whole thing with everybody, but again, just for reference, this is what a meter configuration form looks like. And it has several fields that need to be populated based on what is listed in the CAISO New Resource Implementation system, the RIM system. So we would prep this form, and then typically it's going to be your meter programmer that is going to be filling out sections 3 and 4 of this form. They'll show which channels are going to be programmed. They'll also provide some notes in the bottom if there's anything specific about how the meters are going to need to be, summed together, things like that. That would be added into the notes. Peer-to-peer communication. So, for example, if you have a site that has multiple different meters that are going to need to communicate to one another for either loss calculation purposes, that would be something we would check in this box. We would identify, yes, we are doing a peer-to-peer communication scheme, and then we have to note how those meters are going to be communicating in a metering overview. So we'll talk about that as the next submittal. Again, I don't want to go through each of these because that's a lot, but so metering overviews. Like I mentioned, if you have a site that has a complex metering scheme, if you're in a peer-to-peer configuration, if you're co-located with shared facilities, CAISO is going to request that you submit a metering overview. Metering overview has to have the following contents listed. So they're going to want to know what is this project? What's the fuel type? Where is it located? How many megawatts is it? What's the point of delivery substation? They want to know how all of the meter data is going to be recorded and in what channel. They want to know what the accuracy is of the CTs and PTs. They want to know how you're going to be addressing any aux loads or station service load. They want to know if you're going to be assessing any line losses or transformer losses in those meters. So this is really just CAISO's orientation document that gives them an idea of how the site is supposed to be communicating from a metering perspective. So this is requested usually once they see the single line drawing and all the meters and how they're going to be, if they're going to be communicating with other meters, they'll want to see a metering overview that explains how that's going to work. Right, so we're getting to the end, folks, and I'm leaving plenty of time for questions. So I hope everybody's got lots of questions for me. But sync prerequisites, CAISO point-to-point testing, and regulatory contracts, buckets 3 through 4. So this is once you've gotten your resource into the full network model. We're going to jump back over to our handy dandy schedule here. So you've gotten through the submittal deadline, you've gotten into a full network model scope, and you've now got your CAISO resource ID assigned. What is the next step? How do we get ready for market readiness and sync approval? That's what we're going to talk about next. So there's a whole bunch of other bucket 3 submittals that we'll go through in detail. But as we work towards getting all of those bucket 3 submittals completed, we want to do that as soon as we have that CAISO resource ID assigned. Certain submittals cannot be completed until the resource is in production, which is this big red circle over here. So that's the production week. That's when CAISO's model is being deployed into their production environment. And what that means is that resource ID that they've assigned is then able to be associated to different applications within CAISO's purview. So for example, master file is one of those, and scheduling coordinator association is another one. And then also CAISO point-to-point testing. That means that CAISO's EMS has the points available to be tested for that resource. So talk a little bit about that too. But in order to prepare the resource to request sync from CAISO, we need to have all of our bucket 1 through 4 submittals accepted. We have to have regulatory contracts executed, and we have to have a successful point-to-point test with CAISO. So I'm going to walk you through the first step there, which is our bucket 3 submittals, and what we can expect there. Bucket 3 of the CAISO process is all about market readiness, making sure that the site is ready to enter the test energy phase. Bucket 3 submittals vary depending on the project type and fuel type of the resource, but I'll go through kind of what the typical submittals are and what they're supposed to represent. So just and we'll go a little bit more in depth into a couple of these, but the ECN and CPS agreements, these are form documents that CAISO has published that are required to be signed prior to our scheduling for point-to-point testing. It's their external network guidelines document and a subscriber agreement for their real-time device. So both of those submittals need to be in and accepted before CAISO will allow us to do our point-to-point testing. Same is true for the 24-hour contact form. This form is, again, deceptively simple. There are several different contacts that need to be identified in this form. Primarily, it needs to be your 24/7 contact. That is who CAISO's real-time operations is going to reach out to if they're seeing issues with the resource. So that's a really important one that they want to have in and accepted before we even schedule a point-to-point test. GRDT, that's the generator resource data template, and explanation document. Those two documents go together. They need to be submitted together and accepted together. Talk a little bit more about those, but the explanation document, this is really just an artifact that CAISO needs to have on file that explains the resources design capabilities and how they were calculated. We typically get this from the equipment manufacturer, either the panel manufacturer, inverter manufacturer for the generator, that shows what are the generating parameters of this resource. It's like a spec sheet, basically. We upload to CAISO as an explanation for that GRDT document. If the resource is a PV or wind resource, we also submit the CEC pre-certification letter and participating intermittent resource letter of intent. That's for, again, resources that are PV or wind. We submit that in bucket 3. Control and protection. So going back to the different interconnection agreements, if we have a transmission three-party resource, we have control and protection submittals that we have to provide in bucket 3 of the CAISO NRI process. There are 2 different types of control and protection documentation that they are looking for. The first is the substation relay settings. These can be the initial settings, but they need to be provided for all devices identified in the 3-line drawing. So that's one thing, and they need to be as a PDF. They cannot be in their native file format. So it should be the initial settings. And then we also need to provide inverter settings. So in addition to the relay settings, any generators using inverters, solar, wind, batteries, they have to provide documentation that the inverters have been programmed with protection codes and in accordance with the requirements in their LGIA to be compliant with NERC standard PRC 24 and any FERC recommendations. So this is always a problem document. This is always something that we have to kind of go back and forth on. As a best practice, we recommend getting this in as soon as humanly possible once we have that resource ID assigned, because the review process on this is absolutely just very protracted. So something to keep in mind if you have a 3-party interconnection agreement is, when do you want to request this documentation? As soon as possible. Attachment A is a submittal document that goes along with those inverter settings reports. It is typically submitted during the interconnection application process initially. So we would take that submittal and repurpose it for NRI in bucket 3. SC letters are the last item that we typically upload in bucket 3. There are 2 of them. One needs to be submitted by the resource owner. That's the scheduling coordinator selection letter. The other is submitted by the scheduling coordinator that is going to be representing the resource in the CAISO market, and that is the SC acceptance letter. A new-ish development with CAISO on this submittal is that we do need to have an EIA plant code assigned before we submit SC letters. If we do not have that EIA plant code, CAISO will not accept our scheduling coordinator letters, and we will not be able to request sync. So that's a really important item to track as well. All right, diving a little deeper into the GRDT. Again, this stands for the Generator Resource Data Template. So this is the initial submittal of what the resource is going to be, how the resource is going to be represented in the market side of CAISO's modeling. So some common items that my team looks at and preps, we want to make sure that the participating generator agreement name, so the name of the resource matches up with what we are representing on the CAISO regulatory contracts and interconnection agreement. We want to make sure that the resource type is identified properly, fuel type, max gen, so this would be the maximum output of the resource. Minimum gen is the minimum generation output of the resource. So for storage resources, this can be a negative number. So you may have a 100 megawatt battery facility that has a positive 100 megawatts as a max gen and a negative 100 megawatts as a minimum gen number listed in this submittal. Co-located, that's another one that I'll flag. If there is a co-located resource that is part of a generation facility with other multiple resource IDs behind a single point of interconnection, this would be flagged, and we would need to make sure that we have the resource participating in the aggregate capability constraint, that's the ACC limit, so that even if there's overbuild behind that point of interconnection, there's never a time when any of those resources would be able to go over that POI limit. Good lesson learned, I'll just flag for this one, is that the limits in this submittal need to be coordinated with the commissioning team to make sure that we have the parameters listed properly. Unfortunately, we've seen instances where the site was intending to use grid charging during commissioning, but they did not have that min-gen negative number listed in this submittal. So it impeded the site from being able to use grid charging to commission their batteries. So that's a really important piece that we would want to make sure is understood by the overall team is what are you going to need to do commissioning? How is that represented on this initial RDT submittal? The good news is this is something that can be updated by the scheduling coordinator at any time after the SC association is complete. They can make updates to this GRDT in their interface, which is known as master file. However, that does take time. It's a minimum of 7 business days for those updates to be reflected moving forward. So that can impede your commissioning schedule if this document doesn't have those parameters listed properly. We always recommend that your scheduling coordinator reviews this document before it gets submitted to CAISO, because they are actually going to be responsible for, responding to CAISO's bids and representing the resource in the market. All right, regulatory contracts. So once you have your RDT accepted, we would go through the process of requesting regulatory contracts with CAISO. This is a sync prerequisite. It is not necessarily an NRI submittal, but it is adjacent to and critical for the NRI process to be successful. So in order to request sync, the resource must have all of our required regulatory contracts executed. For most of our projects, that's a participating generator agreement or a PGA. This document is executed between the legal entity representing the resource. Again, has to also be on the interconnection agreement. Can't be an entity that doesn't exist on the interconnection agreement, and CAISO. There's also a meter service agreement that needs to be executed. And again, depending on what type of metering you're doing, CAISO metering versus scheduling coordinator metering, there are two different agreements required for that. So MSA CAISO ME is executed between the resource owner and CAISO. MSA SCME is executed between the scheduling coordinator and CAISO. So it just depends on how the metering is going to be settled, which agreement would apply to your resource. Again, I'll flag as a lesson learned, beware of multiple legal entities that are listed on the same interconnection agreement. We, again, have had instances where, say we have multiple LLCs listed on the front page of an interconnection agreement. We have at a Schedule 1 of that, of the participating generator agreement that lists out all of those different resources and legal entities. Every time we update that legal agreement, we need to make sure that all of those other resources that are on that interconnection agreement and that are on that participating generator agreement are updated. So we just want to make sure that if it's an existing interconnection agreement and if it's an existing participating generator agreement, we are making sure that all of those resources are updated when we're adding a new resource. So that's a lesson learned for us. We also want to make sure that the regulatory contacts that we have listed in RIMS are accurate before we request these contracts from CAISO. If we request them and CAISO sends them to the wrong people, that could be a problem just from a timing standpoint. Usually we're under kind of a time crunch to get these done. So we want to make sure that we're sending them to the right people. And the other thing, again, for the metering side to keep in mind is that meter service agreements do require meter exemptions for any metering exemption required for that project to be filed and approved. This is represented on Schedule 2 of the MSA CAISO ME. So that's another item to check on. Oh boy. So once we have our RDT accepted and our regulatory contracts executed, the next step is to do our scheduling coordinator association. I like this timeline because I think it really outlines when we should be having these conversations and how long it takes to really get through each of the steps in the process for market readiness in bucket 3. So from the time we get a resource ID assigned and we submit the GRDT and GRDT explanation, CAISO has 10 business days to review and accept that documentation. Once that is accepted, only then can we request regulatory contracts, which are the two we just talked about, the participating generator agreement and the meter service agreement. That can take about a week to get executed, and they can only be executed once that resource ID is in production. So we've got to get through the production deployment week, and then we get our regulatory contracts executed. Then we draft scheduling coordinator letters. Those letters, again, need to be submitted, take 10 business days to be accepted. And once those are accepted, that's typically the last bucket item for bucket 3 that we're doing. We can then move forward into bucket 4 and requesting sync. But we cannot sync the resource until the SC association is effective. So we've seen this happen a couple times where resource owners have, asked us to submit SC letters with an SC effective date that is past their target sync date. That's not going to work. We have to have the SC association effective. We recommend at least 7 business days prior to our target sync date so that the scheduling coordinator can start submitting test energy schedules and they have time to be able to do that. So that's a really, really important timeline to be aware of, is that SC association has to be effective at least 7 business days ahead of time. So we just want to make sure we're tracking towards that. Once that SC association is complete and we've got sync approval from CAISO, that SC is responsible for submitting test energy schedules. Talk about that later this afternoon if you want to stick around for our commissioning section. All right, so I talked a little bit about this initially, but control and protection, this is another bucket 3 submittal that we want to make sure we're getting early because there is a long lead review on this item. Typically, we're seeing 30-day turnaround times for this submittal on reviews. This is just the initial substation protective relay settings. This is pre-commissioning settings. So like I mentioned previously, you have to have them in a PDF format. They cannot be in .rdb or .sel relay setting files. They have to be PDFs. They have to match what is on the accepted single line and 3-line drawings for control and protection devices. So we have to have corresponding settings files that go along with all of the protection devices that are listed on that drawing. Common errors or causes for delay in approval of this submittal are if we're missing relays for specific devices, or if we have a single line drawing that maybe was accepted in bucket 1 for modeling purposes, but did not include all of the required protection information that the CAISO Grid Assets team needs to see in order to properly review this submittal. That includes things like circuit breaker trip, closed control circuits, bill of material for protective relays, complete list of relay settings. Again, we just kind of talked about that. So there, at this time, there is really limited availability for CAISO review. So like I said, this is one that we want to get early. We want to get submitted early so that we can get it accepted before our target sync date. And keep in mind, since these are just the initial settings, we do get the opportunity to true these up post-commissioning in bucket 5 of the NRI process. We submit the as left relay settings. We submit those in bucket 5 of the NRI process in addition to the relay test reports from the field relay testing. All right, attachment A, an inverter settings report. Talked a little bit about this one earlier as well. We do have to review them both together, and the settings need to match up between both documents. We review the attachment A to confirm that all the required fields have been completed, including short circuit data. CAISO is now requesting for attachment A's, they now want to see 2-cycle short circuit data as well. So previously it was just 3-cycle data. Now they want 2-cycle data. There's a new attachment A template that needs to be completed that shows that. So I think I stated earlier that we can use the attachment A that was submitted in the initial interconnection request. However, if that attachment A template is the old version that does not include 2-cycle data, we would need to convert it to the new version and add that 2-cycle data as well. So that's something that we would review in our process. CAISO will review these submittals against your executed interconnection agreement. So keep that in mind. If there are discrepancies between what we've submitted in bucket 3 and what's approved in the interconnection agreement, this will cause a delay in approval of the submittal and a delay in sync approval. So that's something to be aware of. We see this all the time. We see projects that are changing inverter types, and what we're representing in bucket 3 of the NRI process is different from what they have approved in their interconnection agreement. That will get flagged in this review. And then the inverter settings report, again, that goes along with this attachment A, that should reflect the settings that are listed in Appendix H of your interconnection agreement. So if you don't know what those settings are, ask to see your interconnection agreement and make sure that the inverter manufacturer that is providing you with this settings report is providing settings that are within those parameters. Okay, hope everybody's still awake and with me. But we're on to bucket 4, folks. We're almost there. This is PTO sync approval. Okay, so you've gotten through all of your bucket 3 submittals. You've got an SC association. All of your control and protection documentation is accepted. You're good to go. What's the next step? We need to get a letter from the utility. How hard can that be? No, it sometimes can be pretty hard. So we have. This is the only submittal in bucket 4. This is the only thing standing between you and your resource at this point, achieving synchronization with CAISO, is a letter that needs to be provided from your participating transmission owner partner. So they call these different things, of course, they can't make it easy. Each of the different PTOs has different language for what they call this letter. PG&E calls it permission to parallel for test purposes only. Edison calls it 10-day notice of initial synchronization and testing. SDG&E calls it PTO approval. of initial sync and COD. Sometimes they give you one letter for both, which is always nice. But what we need to know and what we would review for this submittal is making sure that this letter includes all of the required information. So it needs to have your CAISO resource ID, NRI project code, the megawatt net POI value needs to be exactly what we have showing in RIMS. They need to state that transmission upgrades, if applicable, have been completed, and that all of the utilities testing and pre-parallel inspection is also complete. We cannot have any limitations or conditions listed on this sync letter. If there are any limitations listed, CAISO will not accept it. So that's something, again, to keep in mind when we're having conversations with the utility. A lot of their testing requirements and commissioning requirements are happening in parallel while we're getting through bucket 3 of the CAISO NRI process. The prerequisites for them to give us this letter are happening usually at the same time in an ideal world. So once we have a letter from them, this is the last item that we have to upload to CAISO before we can request sync approval from them. So we do scrutinize this submittal, even though it seems pretty straightforward, because again, any limitations that they place on this letter or exceptions will cause it to get flagged and rejected by CAISO. Most PTOs that we work with have a template that they're already working from. As a best practice, my team likes to review that template beforehand if they'll allow us to do that, and we just confirm that they've got the right project code on there, they've got the correct resource ID assigned, the megawatt values match, there's no discrepancies there. Unfortunately, even something as simple as transposing a number can get this submittal rejected. So we really want to make sure that whatever we're getting from the PTO has been reviewed and that it is not going to have any of those kind of clerical errors on it that would prevent it from getting accepted. So what are the prerequisites of getting this letter from the utility perspective? Well, typically those prerequisites include backfeed. So remember way back an hour and 15 minutes ago when we were talking about the difference between energization, backfeed, sync. So from the utility's perspective, backfeed is when you are able to energize all of your substation equipment, but you're not able to put any energy onto the grid. So for most utilities, backfeed is a prerequisite for them being able to provide you with the sync approval letter. So if you don't have backfeed yet approved, it's highly unlikely that the utility is going to give you this letter. So that's something, again, to just keep in mind the order of operations. Another item related to that would be installation, commissioning, and testing of any utility metering. This needs to happen prior to when this letter gets submitted. Any submittal of required test reports, equipment specifications, diagrams, documentation that's requested by the utility in their interconnection guidelines, that needs to be submitted prior to them giving you this letter. So a good example is I know PG&E has their G5 schedule that outlines all of their requirements for sync and then also their requirements for issuing a COD approval letter. This Edison has their interconnection guidelines that also list out those requirements. So each of the utilities has their own requirements that need to be addressed prior to them issuing this letter. And from CAISO's perspective, this is the only documentation that they get that your resource has met all of those requirements, is this one letter from the utility. So that's why it's so important that we talk about it and review it early on. So once we receive it and review it and it looks acceptable, we upload it to CAISO. They have 10 days to review this document. Most of the time they're not taking the full 10 days, but don't, well, I guess I'm having this recorded so you can quote me on that. Most of the time it's a little quicker than 10 days for this submittal just because it's really easier to review. So the last item that needs to be addressed prior to the resource receiving sync approval that is not a bucket item is point-to-point testing. So at the beginning of this presentation, We talked about what are the requirements for getting to sync approval. It's buckets 1 through 4 being accepted, regulatory contracts being executed, and a successful point-to-point test with CAISO. I'm not going to talk about the technical requirements for point-to-point testing today. We have a whole other 2-hour session if you'd like to join us for that, starting later today on point-to-point testing requirements. But I am going to talk about what my team needs to have completed prior to even scheduling this test with CAISO. So what do we need to have completed from a bucket submittal in order to schedule this test? We have an accepted rig details form with a static public IP address that is valid and reachable on that device. We need to have meter config forms or an SQMD plan approved in bucket 2. We need to have accepted ECN and CPS agreements. Remember, those are the subscriber agreements and network user agreements that are form agreements with CAISO. We submit those in bucket 3. We need to have an accepted 24-hour contact form that Ops Readiness can reach out to if they're seeing any concerns from their side on that resource. Those are the bucket submittal requirements that we have to have done before we even schedule this test. CAISO readiness. So this is what CAISO has to have done before we can schedule this test. They need to have your resource ID assigned. They need to have that resource ID in production. So if we go back to that full network model table schedule that I showed you, this test has to be scheduled after the production week that corresponds with what full network model you got assigned to. We need to have a communications check complete. That is recommended to be done 5 days prior to our scheduled point-to-point test. So we need to reach out to CAISO, confirm that they can see that the rig is visible in their system, that the rig certificate is installed and ready to go. That's something your rig programmer would typically do. But that's what they're going to need to see on their side. Site readiness. So this is what the site has to be ready for before we schedule point-to-point. We need to have a communications network up at least 30 days prior to that test. Here to drink, folks. We need to have CAISO IP addresses added to the site firewall as safe. There's a list of CAISO IP addresses that need to be configured on the site firewall if you have one. All of the originating devices need to be installed, energized, programmed, and pre-tested prior to the point-to-point test. And that pre-testing needs to be completed 5 days prior to our point-to-point, which is when we would notify CAISO that we're ready to do this test. This isn't an ideal world, and I very much recognize that, but I think that just for everyone's awareness, that's what we should all be striving towards, is making sure that we understand what we need to have completed, what CAISO needs to have ready, and what the site needs to have ready before we even schedule this test. The reason I harp on this is because getting a testing date with CAISO is a precious thing, and they are very, very busy, and they have a lot of different resources that are trying to get tested. So this is an important date for everybody to pull towards, agree on, and make happen. So I think that, again, we can have a lot more in-depth conversations about how that test actually goes in the next session, but just from a readiness perspective, this is what I would expect before we even schedule anything with CAISO. What is point-to-point testing? Just as a quick aside, again, it's the conclusion of metering and telemetry testing and commissioning. It means that your metering is inspected and all the testing is already complete. It's just essentially integration into CAISO's system. Rig pre-testing, again, that should already be completed by the time we get there. We need to have all of those CAISO real-time points that they want to see configured properly, scaled properly, and there's no issues with communication between those devices. Typical parties to point-to-point testing, I'll just identify those. So you want to have your site commissioning team involved for point-to-point testing. You want to have your rig programmer involved for point-to-point testing. You will need, if you are a CAISO metered entity, you will need a CAISO certified meter inspector involved in your point-to-point testing. Sometimes the utility also wants to be on site for that point-to-point testing so they can do their burden testing as well at the same time and get their meters all finalized at the same time as the CAISO meters are being sealed up. You also want your SCADA and power plant controller folks involved in point-to-point testing as well. So a lot of different parties involved here that need to make this happen. All right, so you've gotten sync approval, everybody. Give yourself a round of applause. We've got through buckets 1 through 4. We've executed regulatory contracts. We've got a successful point-to-point test. How does sync get approved with CAISO? Well, somebody goes into RIMS and pushes a big green button that says sync. And what does that do? It starts a chain reaction of all of these different reviews that need to happen. This process takes approximately 15 business days. It is not a slam dunk by any means. Each of the different groups that are represented on the screenshot here will take a look at your resource, and they will accept your or approve your sync request or reach out if there's something that is preventing them from doing so. So as a quick just summary of who's reviewing what. NRI is looking at all the resources requesting sync. They are responsible for kind of herding all of these other folks to review that sync request. They're going to look and make sure that, again, all the bucket 1 through 4 submittals are in and accepted. And then they're going to go chase down everybody else to make sure that they approve your sync request as well. EDOS is going to make sure you have a successful point-to-point test. That's what they're going to be looking for. And they're also going to be reviewing site telemetry, making sure that the site is in good telemetry when they request sync. Operational engineering will confirm that all grid contingencies have been met to ensure grid reliability once trial operation starts. Ops readiness, they have their own independent internal check for required real-time information for resources connected to the CAISO controlled grid. Queue management, they will confirm that all three-party LGIA or SGIA requirements for sync have been completed, and they will also review that PTO sync approval letter. Once all the business units approve, then CAISO sends out a basket of fruit. No, they don't. They send out an email that says, congratulations, received sync approval for your project. Please have your scheduling coordinator start submitting test energy schedules for test energy when you're ready to do so. Keep in mind, just because you have sync approval from CAISO does not mean that you can automatically start putting energy onto the grid or pulling energy off of the grid. But that has to be submitted as part of the scheduling coordinator test energy schedules from this point forward. So it's not like automatically you get it and you can just keep going. That's not how that works. We made it, everybody. I can't wait to see how many questions we have. So I will go ahead and turn it back over to Sarah. We have about 30 minutes to answer questions. So lots of folks have lowered.
Thanks a lot, Kelsey. All right, so our first question that came in was co-located projects, do they have the same interconnection point?
They can, yes, they have the same interconnection point. That is all listed out in your interconnection agreement in Appendix C.
Great, and then the second question came from Kyle, and Kyle, you also have your hand up, so I'm gonna go ahead and unmute everybody. So Kyle, if you wanna go ahead and unmute yourself, and if you wanna ask your question, go ahead.
Yes, I think.
Perfect. Sorry, hold on, I'm just switching cameras over. I am the asset manager for Fervo Energy, so we're obviously very interested in kind of understanding this process a little bit further. So I got two questions. The first one I put in the chat there. Co-located projects each will have to have their own NRI project or process. Okay,
That's
so if we
correct.
have like expansion phases, there'll be like a new process will start for the expansion phase.
Correct. So
okay.
we drive that off of your, so there's two different, I'll break this down a little bit because there is, as with all things CAISO, there's nuance. So in your interconnection agreement, you may have identified their capital P phases in that interconnection agreement where those are intended to be how the project's brought online, like formally. So you may have phase 1 of an interconnection that's 100 megawatts, phase 2 that's 150, phase 3 that's 50, and those are outlined specifically in your interconnection agreement. Those would be considered individual resource IDs that are identified in that interconnection agreement. We also have more informal projects, resource ID assignment that's based on what you have in an offtake agreement. So you may have one interconnection agreement that doesn't have any phases, that just says you have 500 megawatts of capacity here. And you want to chop that up into 5 different PPA agreements with different off-takers. That's 5 different resource IDs, just based on that. So hopefully that's helpful.
Crystal clear, thank you, appreciate it. And then the second question, I know it probably requires like a whole separate presentation, but I assume this is more focused on generation within CAISO. Our project Cape is going to be in Utah and tie in and import energy into California. How does the import kind of change the process?
Is it an EIM participating resource, Kyle? Is it going to be in the energy imbalance market?
Possibly. You tell me.
Okay. So, yeah, no, that's what it sounds like. So that process is actually going to go through whichever utility you're working with. That is the EIM participating entity that you're working with. So I don't know in Utah who that would be. I'd have to look at the
Be like
EIM.
Pacific Core or Rocky Mountain Power or something.
So they would submit all of the required modeling documentation, ICCP data to CAISO to include your resource in their EIM fleet, essentially. So that's done through the EIM participating entity, not necessarily at the resource owner level. You coordinate that with them.
Okay, so we would just to follow up on that, we would go to Rocky Mountain Power and say, you model this, we're going to work with you to model this resource, then you will submit that verification. You've done your checks to CAISO, and then they'll work it there. Okay, appreciate it. Thanks.
No problem.
Oh, sorry, I got one more question. Is this, I know it's recorded, is this available for future? Can I like get a copy of this recording?
Yes, absolutely. We will share the links for the online versions. It'll probably be next week.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much.
Great questions. Okay, does anyone else have questions? Again, you can either raise your hand, go ahead and unmute your mic and speak up, or if you would prefer to type in chat, you can do that as well.
I've numbed them all into. Well, I hope it was informative. And also, if anyone wants me to go back to anything, if I glazed over something that you want to talk a little bit more about, I'm happy to jump back in the presentation as well, if there's a specific area that folks have questions about.
Way to keep asking questions. I got it all day here. You said going back to the project details form about the legal entity. So can the project name and the legal entity be different? Because the legal entity has to be interconnection, right? So that's the legal entity.
So the
project
legal
name
entity has to be represented on your interconnection agreement with CAISO. So that's the key there. The project name can be whatever you guys want to name it. There's some really fun, creative ones out there these days. So there are naming convention guidelines that CAISO has published in their generator management business practice manual that list out, there's certain names I think now that they do not want any more of. I know we've been told that anything with desert in it, Edison doesn't want to see any other resources with desert whatever named after it. So we have a lot of projects that were initially desert something, and now they're going to be changing those names because there's just too many resources with similar names.
Okay, and then I think my last question, unless I can think of more, from the beginning of the process to the end of the process, like what's your ballpark estimate of like time?
Ooh, okay, so our rule of thumb for three-party projects, okay, so for projects that require their transmission connected and they have the control and protection requirements, we want to start submitting documents at least 12 months ahead of time, ahead of your target COD date. So that's our rule of thumb. We would want to engage with you probably, 16 to 18 months before we even start the NRI process, just because there's a lot of due diligence that we do on the front end of projects from a site configuration perspective, making sure we understand your metering needs. And Pat is going to do our our next session is going to talk about that a little bit more in depth. But we do want to get engaged early so that once we start submitting documentation to CAISO, we're sure it's accurate and it's not going to change.
So like 15 months with a
Yeah.
couple months of engagement, and then a full year from like submission of the project form to being fully COD.
Right.
Perfect. Excellent. Thanks.
Yeah.
Great questions. Thanks, Kyle. Does anybody else have questions?
Sorry, I got a
Go ahead.
sorry, I got a question. In terms of, I'm sorry, I might have missed this, but in terms of for an interconnection that's a renewable, which is a transmission interconnection resource, in terms of model submissions that need to be submitted, does I think there have been some presentations, some slides that have gone online that kind of dictate or sort of show what are the needs for when in terms of PSCAD models or whatever. Is that and those are more vendor specific, seems like, and not necessarily generic. Is that still going forward? Is that something that's um that's the path that I guess the CAISO will follow, or is there any kind of acceptance in terms of generic models being accepted?
Yeah, so for what my team is looking for when you start submitting documentation to CAISO, it does have to be specific to that resource. So, and the file type requirements at this time that CAISO can accept, I don't believe they are accepting PSCAD models for the dynamic or positive sequence load flow modeling that we have to submit in bucket 1 of the CAISO process. So we would be looking for .byd, .epc files for specific to that generator, if that helps. They wouldn't be generic models. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I guess my question was more not for, I guess I can understand the resource, but does it have to be vendor specific versus can it be a generic model? And sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're saying it needs to be vendor specific, meaning the vendor has to supply it.
Yeah, so vendor specific to me, I think you're referring to more of like the inverter models. Is that?
Yes, and yes.
Okay, yeah, so right now, just for the purposes of what CAISO NRI is asking for, we don't submit inverter modeling data to CAISO. We just submit overall generator interconnection modeling data, if that makes sense. That includes, whatever the inverter manufacturers provided to generate those models, but we're not submitting vendor specific models to CAISO. If that makes sense. We're submitting just for the overall interconnection itself.
Okay, all right.
So they're not at the inverter level, if that's helpful.
Okay, no, sounds good. Thank you.
Great, thank you for your questions. Anybody else?
Well, I'm happy to wrap up with some best practices and lessons learned. So I wrote a couple of things down here, and I hope these will be key takeaways for everybody. Make sure, again, that the correct legal entity has been added to the interconnection agreement before we start the process. That can really hold us up, unfortunately, if we don't have that in place. Understand what the parallel processes are from a utility perspective and a CAISO perspective. When we're talking about the PTO sync approval letter, a lot of those utility requirements can be done in parallel with our bucket 3 submittals. So in an ideal world, we would be submitting that bucket 4 PTO approval letter as soon as it's available. So we have that out of the way. That's the key to really accelerating our ability to get sync approval is getting that PTO letter as soon as possible and getting our point-to-point test completed the first time. So that would be another lesson learned for me is, make sure that we're really ready to go with point-to-point testing. I know that I kind of ran through just the specific requirements from a readiness perspective, but from the site perspective, you know, CAISO really wants to see that the resource is fully ready to be in the market, even if it's just in test energy. So that's a really important component of that testing, is just making sure that we do have all of those devices programmed properly and ready to go. So that's an important component to all of this. But I'm really thankful that all of you decided to join me and hear me ramble for an hour and 40 minutes today. So thank you so much for joining. I hope most of you will stick around and for our next session, which is going to focus more in depth on the point-to-point testing, meter certification requirements, validation requirements. I think that'll be a really great session for folks who have a little bit more of a technical inclination. And then come back this afternoon, hear me ramble some more about site commissioning and COD readiness and COD approval with CAISO.